Ethan Calloway walked into his mother's dining room with his mistress on his arm, like she was a trophy he'd just won at auction. Diane Marsh, 31, silk dress, smile sharp enough to cut glass, pressed herself against him and looked around the Calloway estate like she was already measuring the curtains for replacement. Ethan didn't even flinch, didn't lower his voice, just pulled out her chair, let her sit at the head of the table, and looked across at his mother with an expression that said, "This is how it is now. Get used to it." But if you've ever watched someone throw away something irreplaceable for something that only looked like gold, stay until the very end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Calloway estate sat on 11 acres outside of Ashford, Connecticut, behind iron gates and a long gravel drive lined with old oak trees that had been there longer than the family's money. The house itself was Georgian revival. 3 stories of pale stone, black shutters, and the kind of quiet authority that old wealth builds without trying. Inside, it smelled like beeswax and cedar and something faintly floral that Evelyn Calloway had kept burning in the foyer for as long as anyone could remember. Ethan had grown up hating how serious the place felt. Even as a boy, he'd run through those halls trying to make noise, trying to fill the silence his father left behind when he died. A coronary, too young, in the middle of a conference call. The estate had swallowed that grief without a sound, the way it swallowed everything, and kept standing. He'd brought Isabel here for the first time 9 years ago. She'd been 32 then, finishing her residency, wearing a green dress that was slightly too big because she'd bought it on sale and planned to have it altered and never found the time. She'd stood in the foyer and looked up at the ceiling, at the plasterwork medallion his great-grandfather had commissioned, and said, "Whoever designed this room understood that beauty should make you feel small in the best possible way." His mother had heard that from the top of the stairs, had come down 4 steps before Isabel even knew she was there, and looked at her with an expression Ethan had never once earned in 30 years of trying. That was a long time ago. Tonight, he walked in with Diane. They were 40 minutes late, which was intentional. Ethan had learned years ago that his mother weaponized punctuality. The earlier you arrived, the more time she had to dismantle you before dinner was even served. He told Diane they'd arrive at 7:40, let his mother sit with her disapproval for a while, and walk in when the power had already shifted. What he hadn't planned for was the car already parked at the side of the house. He almost missed it. It was a rental, a modest silver sedan, nothing that stood out, parked neatly near the kitchen entrance, half hidden by the boxwood hedge his mother refused to have trimmed because she liked the asymmetry. Ethan slowed the Range Rover for a moment, looking at it, and then Diane said, "Are we parking or just sitting here?" And he pulled forward and told himself it was the catering company. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, 70 years old, hair the color of old pewter, worked for Evelyn since before Ethan was born, opened the front door before they reached it. She looked at Diane the way a customs agent looks at a passport that's technically valid but still suspicious. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt." He stepped inside and unbuttoned his jacket. "Is my mother in the sitting room?" "The library, sir." He nodded. Diane stepped in behind him and immediately began looking around with that barely concealed assessment people do when they're calculating what everything's worth. She touched the edge of the console table in the foyer, lifted her eyes to the painting above it, a 19th century landscape his mother had bought at Sotheby's, and made a small approving sound in her throat, like she was shopping. "This way," Ethan said. Oh. The library was at the back of the east wing, 2 sets of French doors, and a left turn past the drawing room. Ethan heard his mother's voice before he reached it, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had run board meetings and charity galas and one very ugly estate dispute in 1998 without ever once rising above a conversational register. He heard another voice answer. He stopped walking. Diane almost ran into him. "What?" He pushed open the library door. Evelyn Calloway stood near the fireplace in a dark navy dress, her silver hair pulled back the way she always wore it, for occasions she considered important. She was 71 and looked like a woman who had decided at some point that aging was simply another domain she intended to manage with discipline. Her posture was exact. Her hands were still. She held a glass of red wine she hadn't touched. Across from her, seated in the wingback chair near the window, the one Ethan's father used to read in, was Isabel. Dr. Isabel Carter. 39 now. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and a white shirt, and her dark hair was down, which she almost never wore it, and she looked... Ethan's mind searched for the right word and landed on the one he least wanted. She looked at ease, like she'd been there for an hour, like she belonged. She turned her head when she heard the door, and her eyes moved across Ethan's face with an expression that was not warm and not hostile, and somehow worse than either, it was composed. The expression of a woman who had already cried everything she was going to cry about this man and arrived on the other side of it. Then her eyes moved to Diane. Something shifted in her face, not pain exactly, more like recognition of a fact she'd already prepared herself for. And she set down her tea and stood. "Ethan," she said. Just his name. No edge to it. Diane's hand tightened on Ethan's arm. He looked at his mother. Evelyn looked back at him with the expression she had used his entire life to communicate that he had miscalculated, and she was not surprised. "You're late," she said. "Dinner's in 20 minutes. I'll have Mrs." Pruitt set 2 more places. Mum. The dining room seated 12, and Evelyn had set 4. That detail, 4 plates, 4 chairs, deliberate and symmetrical, told Ethan everything he needed to know about how long his mother had been planning this evening and how little of it had been about welcoming Diane. He sat across from Isabel. Diane sat beside him, her shoulder pressed into his, a gesture of territory. Evelyn sat at the head of the table and spoke to no one in particular while Mrs. Pruitt brought out the first course, a celery root soup with a thin line of cream on top. "Isabel was telling me about the pediatric trial she's running," Evelyn said. "The preliminary results are remarkable." "Thank you." Isabel picked up her spoon. "We're cautiously optimistic. Remarkable might be getting ahead of the data." "A doctor who respects the data." Evelyn looked at the soup. "I find that rarer than it should be." Diane had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone trying to learn the rules of a game that's already started. She put her hand on the table, fingers spread slightly, a gesture Ethan had come to recognize as her way of claiming space in a room, and said, "I didn't know you were still in touch with Ethan's family." The word still landed with the weight she intended it to. Isabel looked at her. "Evelyn and I have stayed close." "Oh." Diane's smile was precise. "That must be complicated." "Not really." Isabel returned to her soup. "We have a genuine friendship. Those aren't complicated." Ethan watched his mother's face for any sign that she would intervene, redirect, diffuse the moment the way she sometimes did when she decided a confrontation had gone far enough. Instead, Evelyn raised her wine glass, slowly, with the absolute lack of urgency of someone who knows they're holding all the cards, and took a long, deliberate sip. She said nothing. The soup was finished. Mrs. Pruitt cleared the bowls. Ethan ate mechanically, tracking the table the way he'd once tracked board meetings, looking for shifts, looking for leverage, trying to read where the danger was. Diane kept her shoulder against his and spoke too much. She talked about the renovation she was planning for his apartment in Manhattan, described it in present tense as though the decisions had already been made, referenced a decorator whose name Ethan recognized from Architectural Digest profiles. His mother listened to all of this with the attentive stillness of a woman absorbing information she intends to use. Isabel ate. She asked Mrs. Pruitt how her hip had been since the surgery. She remembered the name of Mrs. Pruitt's grandson. She did not perform. She did not campaign. The contrast was not subtle. Diane seemed to feel it, the way the room kept orienting itself toward Isabel without effort or announcement, the way even the pauses in conversation landed differently when it was Isabel who left them. Her voice got a fraction louder, her posture got a fraction straighter. "The apartment renovation actually connects to something Ethan and I have been discussing," Diane said during a lull between courses. She glanced at him, a small nod. He recognized the signal. She wanted him to confirm something, validate something, and he sat there for 3 seconds, not sure what he was being asked to confirm. "We're looking at properties," she said, filling the silence herself. "Something in Greenwich, possibly. A house with grounds." She let the word grounds settle over the table. Something more appropriate for a family. Evelyn set down her fork. The sound of it against the china, small, precise, deliberate, filled the room the way a gunshot fills a corridor. "A family," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. It was something colder. It was the word repeated back in a register that stripped it of warmth and left only the structure of it, the bare bones of an implication she found either absurd or offensive, or both. Diane's smile didn't waver. Eventually, yes. Ethan, Evelyn said, still looking at Diane, has never once mentioned that to me. Maybe he didn't feel he needed to. Still pleasant, still precise. Couples often have plans they keep between themselves. You've been together, Evelyn said, for 7 months. I've known my son for 42 years. She picked up her fork again. I believe I understand the difference between a plan and a fantasy. The table went quiet. Ethan felt Diane's shoulder tighten against his. He should have said something then, defended her, or deflected, or pivoted the conversation. And instead he looked across the table at Isabel, who was looking down at her plate with an expression he couldn't read. He had a sudden lurching sense that she had known this was coming, that she had been told, or had simply predicted, exactly how this dinner would go. The main course came. A rack of lamb his mother ordered from a farm in Vermont she'd been using for 20 years, roasted simply with rosemary, the way Ethan's father had liked it. His father's absence was another fixture at Callaway dinners. He appeared in the menu choices and in the silver and in the way Evelyn sometimes paused before speaking, as though measuring whatever she was about to say against a standard he'd left behind. Diane did not know this. She cut her lamb and said it was cooked beautifully and asked if they used a sous vide technique. No, said Evelyn. That was the entire response. Isabel asked about the property in Vermont, whether the spring flooding had affected the grazing land this year, a detail she'd apparently discussed with Evelyn before. The two of them talked for 4 minutes about agricultural drainage and water table shifts, and Ethan sat between his mistress and his history and understood with gathering, awful clarity that he had not been invited to this dinner to celebrate anything. He had been invited to be seen, but after the plates were cleared and before dessert was served, Evelyn folded her napkin, set it beside her place setting with the careful exactness she applied to everything, and said, I'd like to speak with Ethan privately for a few minutes. Diane looked up. And Isabel, Evelyn added, there's a matter to discuss. The silence stretched. Of course, Diane said very evenly. Mrs. Pruitt will bring you coffee in the sitting room. It was not a suggestion. It had the architecture of one, but the function was a dismissal, and Diane knew it. She looked at Ethan. He looked at his mother and saw nothing in her face that invited negotiation. He stood. As he walked out of the dining room, he caught his own reflection in the large mirror above the sideboard. A mirror his mother had hung there specifically, she'd once told him, so that you could see yourself as the room saw you. He looked older than he felt, harder, like a man who had been making the right tactical moves for years without once stopping to ask what he was trying to win. He walked down the hall toward the study. Behind him, he heard his mother's heels on the marble. Ahead of him, in the darkness of the corridor, a door was open. A lamp was on. His father's old leather chair faced the window. Ethan Callaway walked toward it and had the first unshielded thought he'd allowed himself all night. Something is about to end. He just didn't know yet that it was going to be him. The study had not changed in 12 years. That was the first thing Ethan noticed when he walked in. Not the document on his father's old mahogany desk, not the two chairs arranged facing each other near the window, not even Isabel already standing near the bookshelf with her arms folded loosely across her chest, like she'd been waiting there for some time. What he noticed first was that nothing in this room had moved. The same books. The same brass lamp with the green glass shade that cast a sickly, institutional light over everything beneath it. The same framed survey map of the original Callaway land grant, 412 acres in 1887, reduced by sales and taxes, and one very bad decade in the 1970s to the 11 that remained. His father had kept that map as a reminder, he'd always said, of what carelessness costs. Ethan had spent his whole adult life walking past that map without looking at it. He looked at it now. Close the door, Evelyn said behind him. He did. She moved to the desk without hurrying. She didn't sit. She stood behind it the way she sometimes stood at the head of a boardroom table, not because she needed the furniture to give her authority, but because she understood what geometry communicated. The desk between them was a statement. He was on one side of it. She was on the other. Isabel hadn't moved from the bookshelf. "I want to understand something first," Ethan said. He kept his voice even. Board meeting voice, the one he'd learned from watching his father perform composure through situations that probably terrified him. "Why is she here?" "Because I asked her to be," Evelyn said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I'm going to give you about that." She opened the desk drawer, the wide, shallow one on the left, and removed a manila folder which she set on top of the desk without opening it. "Sit down, Ethan." "I'd rather stand." "I know you would. Sit down anyway." He sat. Isabel pulled the chair from the corner near the window and positioned it a few feet from his, not directly facing him, slightly angled, like a witness chair. She sat in it with the composed, straight-backed posture of someone who had spent years sitting in rooms where they had to stay steady while people around them fell apart. Ethan recognized that posture. He'd watched her practice it without realizing that's what she was doing. At hospital fundraisers, at his family's Easter dinners, at the one board meeting he'd brought her to 6 years ago, where his cousin Gerald had tried to undercut her in front of a room full of people, and she'd responded by asking a single clarifying question that made Gerald look so thoroughly unprepared that he'd requested the meeting be rescheduled. She was doing it now, staying steady, waiting. "I'll come to the point," Evelyn said. "Please," Ethan said. "Your father's will established this estate and trust. You know that. What you appear to have forgotten, or chosen to forget, is that the trust has conditions." She paused. Not for effect. She wasn't performing. She was measuring. The primary residence passes to the named beneficiary. It does not pass automatically by default of marriage or lineage. It passes according to the conditions your father wrote, which I have upheld since his death, and which I am still in a position to act on while I'm alive. Ethan had heard some version of this before, fragments of it over the years, in conversations he'd half listened to because the estate had always felt like a given, like weather, like something that existed independently of whatever he did or didn't do. "The conditions," he said. "Your father wrote them in 1997, when you were 17 and already showing signs of becoming exactly the man you've become." She said this without cruelty. That was the terrible part. She said it the way a doctor states a diagnosis. He believed that the estate should pass to someone who understood its purpose, not its value, its purpose. "And what purpose is that?" Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You never asked that question once in 42 years. Not once." Ethan looked at the survey map on the wall. "The trust," Evelyn said, "names a successor beneficiary. In the event that the primary heir, you, demonstrates, in my assessment as trustee, a sustained failure of the values your father considered foundational." She opened the folder. Inside was a document, several pages, the top one bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Hartford that Ethan recognized as the firm his family had used since the 1960s. "This is the formal transfer of primary beneficiary status. It is already signed. It was notarized on Tuesday." Ethan stared at the document without touching it. "The estate," Evelyn said, "passes to Isabel." The room held that sentence the way deep water holds a stone, quietly, completely, without giving it back. Ethan heard himself say, "That's not possible." "It is not only possible, it is done." "She's not. We're divorced. She's not family." "Oh, your father's trust does not restrict the beneficiary to blood family. It restricts it to someone the trustee, me, considers worthy of the responsibility." Evelyn set the folder down. "I have considered this for 3 years. I have not made this decision tonight. I made it in January, and I made it because the conditions were met." "What conditions?" His voice came out flat and strange. "What specific conditions?" Evelyn looked at him the way she had looked at him after the first time he was caught cheating on a school examination, and after the time he fired his father's driver of 17 years without consultation, and after she'd found out about Diane, not from him, never from him, but from the family attorney who'd handled the separation agreement. She had looked at him each of those times with a specific expression that Ethan had always interpreted as disappointment, but understood now, sitting in this chair with the brass lamp throwing green light over everything, was something more precise than that. It was recognition. the recognition of a pattern she had watched form over decades and had no more power to stop than she had power to stop weather. "You left a good woman," Evelyn said quietly, "for a more convenient one. You discarded a marriage, a real one, built over years, built on something, because you wanted space to become smaller, because Isabel asked you to be better, and you decided you'd prefer to be comfortable." She picked up her wine glass from the corner of the desk, where she'd carried it from the dining room. She looked into it. "Your father was afraid of that in you. He wrote it into the trust because he didn't know how else to say it to you while he was alive. He wasn't a man who found words easy." "Neither are you," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "But I'm finding them tonight." The lamp hummed faintly. Outside the window, the wind moved through the oaks along the drive, and the sound came through the old glass like something breathing. Ethan turned to Isabel. He hadn't looked directly at her since he sat down. "Did you know about this? About the trust conditions?" "I knew something existed. Your mother explained the details to me 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks?" "Yes." "And you came tonight anyway?" "I came tonight," Isabel said, "because Evelyn asked me to, and because I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought you deserved to hear it in person, not from a lawyer, not from a letter." "That's generous of you." "I'm not trying to be generous. I just didn't want—" She pressed her lips together. "I didn't want this to be something that happened to you in an office, without a face attached to it." There was something in her voice that wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction either. It was something more complicated and more honest. A reluctance, almost. The sound of someone doing what they believe is right while still feeling the weight of it. Ethan looked at the document. "The transfer is complete," Evelyn said. "It's not contingent on your agreement. The trust is structured to operate independent of your consent in this regard. The attorneys confirmed it in January. So this is what? An announcement." "This is a courtesy," Evelyn said, "which is more than you've extended to most people in your life recently." The silence that followed had a different quality from the others. Less charged, more final. Ethan sat in his father's study, in the house he had assumed would be his in some indefinite but certain future, and understood that the floor he'd been standing on had been hollow for years, and he'd never once thought to check. He stood up. "I need a minute." "Take whatever you need," his mother said. He walked to the window and looked out at the back garden. The stone path, the dark shapes of the hedges, the faint glint of the pond at the far end of the property. He and Isabel used to walk down there in the evenings when they visited. He had a specific memory of standing at the edge of that pond in late October, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, while she told him about a patient she'd lost, a child, 6 years old, something wrong with his heart from birth. And he remembered that he had not known what to say, and so had said very little, and she had not seemed to need him to say anything, and they had stood there in the dark together until the cold drove them back to the house. He hadn't thought about that evening in years. He thought about it now. "Does she know?" he said to the window. "Diane." "No," Evelyn said. "She's going to." "Yes, she is." He turned around. "You planned this." "I planned the timing," Evelyn said. "Your father planned the mechanism. You provided the circumstances." She set down her wine. "I didn't manufacture your choices, Ethan. I simply waited for them to accumulate into something I couldn't ignore." He went back to the dining room alone. His mother stayed in the study. She said she needed to speak with Isabel briefly, which Ethan suspected was her way of giving him exactly 30 seconds of privacy to reconstruct his face before Diane saw it. 30 seconds was not enough. Diane was on her phone when he came in, sitting with her legs crossed and her coffee untouched, and her expression doing the particular thing it did when she felt she'd been left waiting longer than she considered appropriate. She looked up when he came in, read his face, and put the phone face down on the table. "What happened?" she said. "My mother had some estate matters to discuss." "For 20 minutes. It was complicated." "Ethan." She leaned forward. Her voice dropped to the register she used when she was deciding whether to be understanding or angry and hadn't made the call yet. "What did she say to you?" He sat down. The lamb plates were gone. His wine glass had been refilled by someone, Mrs. Pruitt, mechanically continuing through the logistics of a dinner that had long since stopped being about food. She transferred the estate, he said. Diane waited. To Isabel. The word landed, and Diane went very still. Not the stillness of shock, he noticed. It was the stillness of a person rapidly recalculating. Her eyes moved once to the window and then back to him, and he could see her working through it. The estate, the house, the land, what it's worth, what that means, what changes. She can do that? Diane asked. Apparently she already has. There has to be a legal challenge. The trust has to have conditions. If it's arbitrary, if she just decided on a whim, it's not a whim. It's been in place since 1997. My father wrote it. Diane sat back. Her jaw tightened. Your father wrote a clause that lets your mother give your inheritance to your ex-wife. Yes. And you didn't know about this. I knew the trust had conditions. I didn't... He stopped. I didn't think they would ever apply. Why not? He didn't answer. The dining room door opened and Evelyn came in, followed by Isabel, and the four of them occupied the room together for a moment in the particular way of people who have just had a conversation, restructure every relationship between them, and haven't yet figured out what the new geometry looks like. Diane turned to Evelyn. She had gathered herself, quickly, impressively, and her voice when she spoke was controlled and cool. I'd like to understand the legal basis for what you've apparently done. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. I imagine you would. This affects Ethan directly. It affects us. Your relationship with my son, Evelyn said, is not something I've been asked to consider in this matter. Maybe you should have been. Perhaps, but I wasn't. Evelyn picked up her coffee. And the matter is concluded. Diane looked at Ethan, a look that said, do something, say something, push back on this. The look of a woman who had never yet encountered a situation that couldn't be won through pressure and had not yet updated this belief. Ethan was looking at the table. You're doing this to punish him, Diane said to Evelyn. That's what this is. I'm doing this, Evelyn said, because my husband asked me to, 12 years before his death, because he understood his son well enough to know this day might come and wanted the family legacy in the hands of someone who would protect it. Whether that feels like punishment to you is not my concern. Your son, my son, Evelyn said with a quiet and absolute finality that closed the sentence like a door, made his choices. This is the consequence of them. It is not a punishment, it is a structure. There is a difference. Diane pushed back her chair and stood. She was contained. Credit to her, Ethan thought distantly, but the seams were showing. The very careful presentation of herself she'd maintained through the entire dinner was under a pressure it hadn't been designed for. I'd like to leave, she said to Ethan. I'll get Mrs. Pruitt to call a car, Evelyn said. I'll get my own car. She picked up her bag from the chair, looked at Ethan. Are you coming? He sat there. Ethan. He looked up at her. She was standing in the dining room of his family's home in the silk dress and the heels and the careful, perfect composure, and something about the combination of all of it, the dress, the posture, the tactical patience she'd displayed all evening, suddenly struck him as exhausting in a way he couldn't fully explain. Not her exactly. More the effort, more the management of it. Give me a few minutes, he said. Diane's expression changed. A very small change. Something moved through her eyes that he might have called hurt in another context, but looked in this one more like reassessment. I'll wait in the car, she said. She walked out. Her heels on the marble floor of the foyer were precise and unhurried, which was how she did everything. And then the front door opened and closed, and the sound of it echoed through the house and stopped. The three of them sat with the aftermath. Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway, looked at the table, looked at Evelyn, received some infinitesimal signal from her employer, and quietly disappeared. Ethan reached for his wine. He drank half of it in one go, which he was aware was not a dignified gesture, but was the only one available to him at the moment. Say something, he said to his mother. I've said everything I intended to say tonight. Say something else. Evelyn looked at him across the table. And for just a moment, less than a second, the span of a breath, the architecture of her composure shifted. Not collapsed, not broke, just shifted. He saw something that might have been grief, or might have been love, or might have been the particular anguish of a parent who has watched a child walk toward a wall for 20 years and could never figure out how to put themselves between him and it. "I'm not your enemy," she said. "You just gave my house away." "I gave a house to a woman who came to your father's funeral when she was 6 months into knowing us, who visited me in the hospital after my hip replacement and stayed 4 hours when everyone else came for 40 minutes, who, when you asked her to sign divorce papers, did it without lawyers and without a fight and without a single word to the press." Evelyn's voice was even. "I gave a house to a woman who deserved better than what this family put her through. You gave it to her to punish me." "I gave it to her," Evelyn said, "because your father would have wanted it there, with her, safe, not sold off in some settlement 2 years from now." The sentence hit Ethan somewhere undefended. He felt it but couldn't look at it directly. He turned to Isabel instead because looking at his mother felt impossible right now, and Isabel was somehow, despite everything, despite the absurdity of this situation, the face in this room he could tolerate most. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I don't know yet." Seriously. "Seriously, I don't know." She glanced at the window, at the dark garden beyond it. "I've thought about it. I've thought about it a lot, actually. I haven't decided. You could sell it." "I could. It's worth He stopped himself. "A significant amount. I know what it's worth. You could—" He heard himself start a sentence without knowing how it ended, and stopped. Isabel waited. "You could do something with it," he said, which was not what he'd meant to say, and was vaguer than anything useful, but she seemed to understand that he was trying to say something he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. "Yes," she said. "I could." Evelyn stood. She was done with the evening. He recognized the specific way she pushed back from the table when she had accomplished what she set out to accomplish and had no interest in lingering in the wreckage. "Stay as long as you want," she said, to both of them, or neither of them. "Mrs. Pruitt will lock up." She walked to the door and then paused with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "Your father loved you, Ethan. That's what the trust was. It wasn't control. It was the only way he knew to keep saying it after he was gone." She walked out. Ethan and Isabel sat alone in the dining room. The candles his mother had lit for dinner were burning low, throwing unsteady orange light that made the room feel different from how it had felt an hour ago. Smaller, more honest, stripped of the formal quality that candlelight is supposed to add. He looked at the document in his mind. His father's handwriting was not on it. It was a legal document, typed and witnessed and notarized, but he kept imagining it there anyway. Imagining his father sitting in the study in 1997, Ethan 17 years old and already the thing his father was afraid he'd become, writing a clause into a trust that was really a message sent forward in time to a version of his son he hoped might exist by the time it arrived. "I didn't know he thought about it that much," Ethan said. Isabel didn't ask what he meant. "Your mother showed me some of the notes he made when he drafted the trust. Not the legal language. The personal notes. The things he wrote to himself to clarify what he intended." She paused. "He wrote about you a lot." "Good things?" "Complicated things," she said. "Honest things. The kind of things parents think but don't usually say because there's no version where saying them out loud doesn't cost something." Ethan looked at his hands on the table. They were his father's hands. Same width, same blunt knuckles, same way of going still when he was trying to hold something together. "I should go talk to Diane," he said. "Yes. This isn't... She doesn't deserve..." He stopped, restarted. She didn't know what tonight was. "Neither did you, entirely." "No." He pushed back the chair. "But I should have..." He stood, looked at Isabel across the low-burning candles, the empty glasses, the ruins of a dinner that had never been what it appeared to be. "The pond," he said, out of nowhere, not planning to say it. She looked up. "Do you remember? That October. The kid you lost, the boy with..." "Marcus," she said quietly. "Yes. I didn't say anything that night. I stood there and I didn't say anything useful." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "You stayed," she said. That was enough. He held that. Then he nodded once, like a man accepting terms he doesn't fully understand yet, and walked out through the dining room door and down the marble hall and out of the house into the cold Connecticut dark, where Diane was waiting in the car with the engine running and the gravel crunched under his feet, and behind him the Calloway estate sat solid and silent against the sky. He stopped for just a moment, looked back at the house. At the light in the study window, where his father's map still hung on the wall, marking the original shape of something that had been steadily reduced by time and cost and carelessness until only this remained. He thought about what his mother had said, not control, the only way he knew to keep saying it. He got in the car. Diane was looking straight ahead. The heat was on high. The radio was off. She had her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it in the posture of a woman who has made a decision but hasn't announced it yet. "Are you ready?" she said. He looked at the house one more time in the passenger mirror. "No," he said, "but let's go anyway." She pulled forward on the gravel, the headlights sweeping across the oak trees, and the estate disappeared behind the curve of the drive. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Diane said quietly, "It's not going to work, is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He watched the trees pass. The Connecticut countryside at night was all dark masses and the occasional lit window, and it had always felt to him like driving through someone else's life, all that warmth visible and unreachable behind glass. "I don't know," he said. "Yes, you do," she said. He put his head back against the seat, closed his eyes. She was right. She was almost always right about the practical things. It was one of the qualities he'd found compelling and was only now understanding the full weight of the clarity she brought to situations, the unwillingness to pretend something was something other than what it was. "I'm sorry," he said. Diane made a small sound. Not agreement, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The sound of someone filing information. They drove back toward the city in the dark and the heat and the silence, and behind them, somewhere in the Connecticut hills, a house sat with its lights on and all its memories intact, and began its slow process of becoming something that Ethan Calloway no longer owned, and Isabel Carter had not yet decided what to do with. The night had not finished with any of them, but it had made its position clear. Diane left on a Thursday. Not dramatically. That was the thing Ethan kept coming back to in the days afterward. There was no scene, no shouting, no moment that felt like a climax. She had simply packed 2 bags on a Thursday morning while he was on a call in the second bedroom he used as an office. And when he came out, she was standing in the hallway of the Manhattan apartment with the bags at her feet and her coat already on. "I took the things I came with," she said, "and the Mapplethorpe print from the guest room. We bought that together, but you never looked at it." He hadn't argued the point. She was right. He'd never once looked at it. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To Nina's." "Then I don't know." She picked up the bags. She was very composed. He had always admired her composure and was only now understanding how much of it was structural, built to protect against exactly this kind of moment, engineered over years of not letting people see her bleed. "I'm not angry at you, Ethan. I want you to know that." "You should be." "Maybe." She considered it with the same clinical honesty she brought to everything. "But being angry takes energy, and I'd rather spend that energy on something else." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she very rarely did without any agenda behind it. "You were never really here. Even when you were standing right in front of me, you were never fully here. I knew that when I got into this, and I told myself it would change." She picked up the second bag. "It didn't change because it was never going to change. That's not your fault. It's just true." He stood in the hallway of the apartment he'd bought in 2019 for its view of the park, which he also almost never looked at, and watched Diane walk out the door. She didn't look back. The door clicked shut. He stood in the silence for a full minute, waiting to feel something conclusive, grief or relief, or the particular emptiness of loss. What he felt instead was something harder to name, a flatness, like a room after the furniture has been removed, where you can finally see how the light falls and how much space there actually is, and how little of it you'd ever actually used. He went back to the office. He sat down. He looked at the computer screen for approximately 4 minutes before he accepted that he was not going to be able to work, and closed the laptop and sat in the quiet apartment with the park view he never appreciated and the Mapplethorpe-shaped absence on the guest room wall, and began the slow process of understanding what had just happened to his life. The Callaway Company, Callaway Capital, technically, though everyone just called it Callaway, had offices on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that his father had chosen in 1981 for its view of the Hudson. His father had believed in the psychological value of being able to see water from a workspace, something about perspective, about scale, about the reminder that the world was larger than whatever problem was currently on your desk. Ethan had always thought this was sentimental nonsense. He sat in his office on the Monday after Diane left and looked at the Hudson and tried to find the perspective his father had been talking about, and found instead that the river looked gray and cold and exactly as indifferent as everything else. His assistant, a man named Conrad, who had been with him for 4 years and had the energy of someone who had learned to exist in permanent low-level alertness, knocked and entered with the afternoon schedule. "The Hartford attorneys called," Conrad said. "They'd like to schedule a call to discuss the estate transfer." "What is there to discuss?" "They didn't specify. I think they may be looking for instructions about the transition of household accounts." Ethan looked at the Hudson. "Schedule it. Also, your cousin Gerald left 2 messages. Tell him I'll call him back." He used the word urgent, sir. "Gerald finds everything urgent. Tell him I'll call him back." Conrad left. Gerald called again at 3. Ethan let it go to voicemail and then listened to it on speaker while staring at a market summary he wasn't reading. Gerald's voice had this particular quality of a man who has received information he considers advantageous and wants to deploy it before someone takes it away from him. "Ethan, I've heard about the estate situation, and I want you to know I think it's completely unacceptable. Mother left father's trust to an outsider. I'm sorry, I know you were married to her, but she's an ex-wife. She is legally an outsider, and there are grounds to contest this. My attorney has reviewed the trust documents, and he believes the trustee discretion clause may be challengeable on the basis of undue influence. Call me." Ethan deleted the message. He was not sure why. He hadn't thought it through. He just knew with an absolute and instinctive certainty that he did not want Gerald anywhere near this. He went to the estate on a Wednesday. Not because he'd planned to. He drove out of the city in the late afternoon without a particular intention, telling himself he was clearing his head, and found himself on the Connecticut roads and then on the long gravel drive between the oaks, and then sitting in the parked car in front of the house, looking at it like a man staring at a thing he is trying to understand. Mrs. Pruitt answered the door. "Mr. Callaway." She stepped back to let him in with the neutral efficiency of a woman who had navigated 30 years of complicated Callaway family situations and had developed a professional relationship with the concept of not commenting on any of them. "Is my mother here?" "In the conservatory, sir. Dr. Carter arrived about an hour ago." He stopped. "She's here?" "Yes, sir. She's been here several times since the dinner. She and your mother have been going through the rooms." Mrs. Pruitt paused, which for her was the equivalent of a long editorial pause for anyone else. "Making assessments, I believe." He handed her his coat and walked through the house toward the conservatory, which was in the south wing and had been his grandmother's project, a glass and iron addition, Victorian in its proportions, full of plants his mother maintained with the focused dedication of someone who found plants more reliable than people. Through the glass walls he could see 2 figures at the wicker table in the middle of the room, papers spread between them, both of them leaning over something. He opened the door. His mother looked up first, then Isabel, who straightened in her chair and looked at him with an expression that was careful and not unwelcoming. "I didn't know you were coming," his mother said, not as a rebuke, as information. "I didn't either," he said honestly. He looked at the papers on the table. Architectural drawings, he realized. Floor plans. He recognized the layout of the main floor, the proportions of the entry hall, the sitting room, the long back corridor, rendered in the clean lines of a professional draft. "What is that?" he said. Isabel looked at the papers, then at him. She seemed to be making a decision in real time. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I told you at the dinner that I didn't know what I was going to do with it," she said. That was true. For about 2 weeks it was true. She flattened her hand over the drawings. "Then I decided." You're not selling it. No. Then what? She was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that means hesitation, more the kind that means she was choosing words with deliberate care, the way she chose everything. I work with a lot of families, she said. Pediatric oncology, which you know, and the thing that nobody really accounts for, in the system, in the way hospitals work, is what happens to the family while the child is being treated. The parents, the siblings, they come from everywhere. Some of them have no support network nearby. They're staying in motels 20 minutes from the hospital, eating fast food, driving back and forth on 4 hours of sleep while their child is going through something unsurvivable, and they are completely alone in it. She looked at the floor plans. There are organizations that try to address this. Some of them do good work, but the need is bigger than any of them can meet. He looked at the drawings, looked at the floor plan of the room that had been his father's study, now marked with a notation he couldn't read from this distance. You want to turn the estate into, what, a residence? A family support house, she said, connected to the pediatric unit at Hartford General, which is 20 minutes from here. Families with critically ill children in treatment would have a place to stay. A real place, not a motel room. A home for however long they need it. She paused. Your father's library would become a common room. The guest rooms would be family suites. The kitchen is already large enough. The grounds... She glanced at the window, at the garden beyond. Children who are well enough to go outside should be able to go outside somewhere that isn't a hospital parking lot. The room was very quiet. Evelyn was watching Ethan with the careful attention of someone who has already had this conversation and is now observing how someone else receives it for the first time. He looked at the floor plan for a long time. This would cost a significant amount, he said. The words sounded flatter than he intended, and he heard them land that way and moved past them. The renovation alone, conversion of residential to a care facility. There are compliance requirements, ADA standards. I've consulted an architect and a health facility specialist, Isabel said. I have a cost estimate. I have preliminary conversations started with Hartford General about a partnership structure. I have a grant writer who has already identified 4 foundations that fund exactly this kind of project. She looked at him steadily. I'm a doctor, Ethan. I understand how to build a case. I know you do. Then you know this isn't impulsive. I know. He looked at the drawings again. The foundation. Is there a name? She was quiet for a moment. The Carter House Foundation, she said. Your name. My maiden name. Carter. Yes. She watched him. I thought about other names. I thought about it for a while. He understood what she wasn't saying, that she had considered naming it something else, something that included his family's name or his father's name or some neutral institutional title, and had decided to name it after herself instead, after the person who had chosen this, after the person who would carry it. He couldn't argue with that logic. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Your mother supports this, he said. Completely, Evelyn said from across the table. He sat there. He had come to Connecticut without a plan, had ended up in this glass room surrounded by his grandmother's plants, had sat across from the woman he'd left and his mother who'd outmaneuvered him, and was looking at architectural drawings that would transform the thing he'd expected to inherit into something he had never once thought to imagine. The feeling wasn't anger. He'd expected anger, had been waiting for it since the dining room on Saturday night, but it kept not arriving. What was there instead was something more diffuse and less satisfying. A hollow quality, like a frequency his body was producing that had no corresponding sound. I came to ask you something, he said to Isabel. She waited. The drive up I don't know what I was doing. I wasn't thinking about this. He gestured vaguely at the drawings. I wanted to ask you if you were all right. After the dinner, after everything. Something shifted in her face. I'm all right, she said. You don't have to say that. I know I don't have to say it. I'm saying it because it's true. She leaned back in her chair. It wasn't an easy night, for any of us. But I'm all right. You've been all right a lot, he said. Every time I've seen you since the divorce, every time I've heard anything about you through people we know, Always all right. Is that, what, suspicious to you? It makes me feel like you finished the grief a long time ago and moved on, and I'm just... He stopped. Just now starting, she said. Yes. She didn't offer him comfort. He appreciated that. She'd never been a person who offered comfort when honesty was available. You didn't lose the grief when you left, she said. You deferred it. You put Diane in the space where the loss should have been, and now that space is empty again, and it's all there waiting for you. She said it without unkindness. You're going to have to go through it. I know. I can't help you with that part. I know that too. He stayed for dinner. He wasn't sure why Evelyn asked, and he wasn't sure why he said yes, but Mrs. Pruitt set 3 places at the smaller table in the breakfast room off the kitchen, not the formal dining room, which felt like a mercy. And they ate a simple meal that nobody had made any ceremony about and talked about the foundation. Isabel had the practical details organized with the precision of someone who had been constructing this plan in her head for weeks before she'd ever touched a floor plan. The renovation timeline, the partnership structure with Hartford General, the preliminary grant applications, the question of staffing. Not medical staff, she clarified. The hospital would cover clinical needs, but house staff, support staff, someone to keep the building running as a home rather than an institution. Mrs. Pruitt, Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. I've spoken with her, Evelyn said. She's 68 and she has no interest in retiring, and she said, and I am quoting her directly, that she has been keeping this house for 30 years and she will keep it for whoever lives in it next. She'd be willing to stay on, Isabel said. Through the renovation, through the transition. She grew up on a farm in central Vermont, Evelyn said. She is not intimidated by a project. Something loosened in the room. Not fully. There was still too much accumulated weight for anything to loosen fully. But something. Even Ethan felt it. He looked around the breakfast room. He'd eaten more meals in this room than in the formal dining room, if he counted the years of his childhood. Weekend mornings, school holidays, the irregular meals of a house where both parents worked and family dinners were planned events rather than daily rituals. The wallpaper was the same pale yellow stripe it had always been. The window over the sink looked out on the kitchen garden. What does the renovation timeline look like? He said. Isabel glanced at him. Realistically, 14 to 18 months. The structural changes are minimal. The building is solid. The rooms are already the right scale. The work is mostly systems upgrades, accessibility modifications, and the specific requirements for a licensed residential support facility. But that's a significant amount of time to manage without income. The operating costs alone, I have savings, she said. Isabel, I have savings from 11 years of a medical career, and I have no children, and I live in a reasonably priced apartment in Hartford, and I have thought very carefully about this. She said it evenly. I'm not being reckless. I know you're not. He paused. I could. He stopped. She looked at him. I could contribute, he said. The words sat on the table. To the renovation fund, he said, or the operating reserve, however it's structured. She was very still for a moment. Why? Because he didn't have a clean answer ready. Because it was my family's house. And because what you're doing with it is... He looked at the yellow wallpaper, the window, the dark garden outside. It's something worth doing. I'm not looking for an investor, Ethan. I'm not offering as an investor. Then what are you offering as? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands on the table. His father's hands, blunt-knuckled, currently making no particular gesture, just resting flat on the surface. Someone who made a mess, he said, trying to do something about it. Evelyn stood and picked up her plate and carried it to the sink, which she almost never did. There was always someone else to do that in this house. But she did it now, slowly, with her back to the table, giving them a moment that she had probably engineered, but that felt genuine anyway. Isabel looked at Ethan. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. No, you're not, she said. You're asking for more than that. You just don't know exactly what yet. He couldn't disagree with that. Gerald showed up at Ethan's office the following week. He hadn't called ahead, which was either confidence or calculation. And he arrived at 11 in the morning in a gray suit that was slightly too expensive to be appropriate for a Tuesday, and sat down across from Ethan's desk with the expression of a man who has prepared a proposal. Gerald was 45 and had always had the particular energy of a person who believed he had been given slightly less than his share of everything: money, recognition, luck, and had dedicated considerable intelligence to correcting this. He and Ethan had never been close. They'd been cordial at family events and professionally distant in all other contexts, which had suited both of them. "I listened to your message," Ethan said. "I chose not to return it. You should read that as a position." Gerald settled in the chair with the ease of someone who had anticipated resistance and planned around it. "I'm not here to cause problems. Gerald, you have never in your adult life entered a room without intending to cause some variety of problem." A small smile. "The estate situation is a problem that already exists. I'm here to propose a solution." "There's no situation to solve. The transfer is complete. The transfer may be legally contestable. My attorney is looking for a fee. The trust was ironclad. My father's attorney spent 2 decades making it ironclad. Whatever your attorney told you, he told you in the context of being paid to find an argument." Ethan kept his voice flat. "There is no argument." "The undue influence? My mother is 71 and has the cognitive sharpness of a woman 40 years younger and made this decision over a period of 3 years with full legal counsel. There is no undue influence case." He looked at Gerald. "I know what you want. You want a piece of the estate value. You've wanted it since my father's will was read, and you realized your branch wasn't in it at the primary level." Gerald's jaw tightened slightly. He was too controlled to let much show. "That's an uncharitable interpretation." "It's an accurate one." Ethan leaned back. "I'm not going to challenge the transfer. I'm not going to litigate against my mother. I'm not going to create a family spectacle to recover property that my father, very deliberately, made it possible to give away." He paused. "And I'm not going to be the reason that a family support house for pediatric cancer families doesn't get built because 2 men in suits decided their inheritance was more important." The last sentence surprised even him. He hadn't known he was going to say it until it was out. Gerald stared at him. "Is that what she's doing with it?" "Yes." A silence. Gerald straightened his jacket. "That's—" He stopped. "I know," Ethan said. "Your father would have—" "I know," Ethan said again. Gerald left without his proposal gaining any traction, and Ethan sat in his office after the door closed and looked at the Hudson and thought about what he'd just said and who he'd said it as. Not the version of himself from 6 months ago. Not the version who walked into his mother's dining room with Diane on his arm like a trophy and expected the room to rearrange itself around his choices. Someone else was starting to take that version's place. He wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. Isabel called him 2 weeks after the breakfast room dinner. He was in the car when his phone rang, heading back from a meeting in White Plains that had gone longer than expected, and her name on the screen surprised him the way it always surprised him, a reflex response that he suspected would never fully go away. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said. "Okay. I'm not going to accept a financial contribution, not right now." She paused. "But the project needs someone to manage the renovation process, the contractor interface, the permit coordination, the schedule management. It's not clinical work, and it's logistics and construction and a lot of phone calls to government offices. And I don't have time for it on top of my actual job." Another pause. "You know how to manage large projects." He held the phone. "You're asking if I'll manage the renovation," he said. "I'm asking if you want to. There's a difference." "Yes," he said. "I haven't finished." "I know, but yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to be very clear about what this is. It's a project management role. It is not. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. I'm not—" "Isabel." "What?" "I know what it is." A long pause. Through the phone, he could hear the ambient sound of wherever she was. A hallway, maybe, the distant sound of announcement over a PA system. The hospital. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He put the phone down on the passenger seat and kept driving and watched the highway stretch out ahead of him in the late afternoon light, the trees on either side turning toward the gray of November, the sky doing the particular thing Connecticut skies do in late fall, going flat and white and very still, the light draining out of it slowly like water from a shallow dish. The world looked different from behind his eyes than it had 2 months ago. He couldn't locate exactly what had shifted or when. It hadn't been the dinner. It hadn't been the document on his father's desk. It hadn't been Diane leaving or Gerald in his office or the breakfast room conversation. It was something slower than any of those. Something that had been working on him beneath the surface of all those events. In the hours between them, in the quiet of the apartment with its park view and its Mapplethorpe-shaped gap on the guest room wall. He pulled off the highway at a rest stop he'd driven past 100 times and never once used. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. A woman at the picnic table nearby was feeding crackers to a toddler who kept throwing them on the ground and laughing at where they landed. The woman laughed too, eventually, despite herself. The particular laugh of a parent who has accepted that toddlers are inexplicable forces of nature and there's no sensible response to them except surrender. Ethan watched them for a while. He thought about Isabel's words. You deferred it. You put Diane in the space where the loss should have been. He sat with the loss now. Tried to. It was like trying to see something in peripheral vision. It kept not being there when he looked at it directly, and being very much there when he wasn't. He missed things he hadn't known he was missing until tonight. He missed walking that pond path in October. He missed the way she talked about her patients, not with clinical detachment, not with performed sentimentality, but with a specific, honest ache that suggested she understood what it cost and had decided to pay it anyway because the work mattered. He missed the version of himself that had stood next to her in the dark and stayed. He didn't know if any of that was recoverable. He wasn't sure recovery was the right frame. He started the car. Somewhere in Connecticut, a house sat in the November dark with floor plans on a table and 30 years of one family's life in its walls, waiting to become something different, something that hadn't existed before, something that would cost more than money and take longer than expected and be harder than anyone currently sitting in that conservatory planning it could fully anticipate. Ethan Calloway drove back toward the city, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about the road ahead in terms of what he could gain from it. He was thinking about what he might be able to build. The difference between those two things was not subtle, but he was only just now learning to feel it. The first contractor quit in February. Not dramatically. There was no blow-up, no confrontation on the job site. He simply sent an email on a Tuesday morning explaining that his crew had taken on a larger commercial project in Stamford, and he was returning the deposit minus the mobilization costs he'd already incurred. The email was polite and professionally formatted and completely useless because it arrived 6 weeks into a renovation timeline that had already been delayed twice by permit processing, and the February departure meant losing the window before mud season when the exterior drainage work needed to happen. Ethan read the email at 6:40 in the morning, standing in the kitchen of the Manhattan apartment in his socks, and called the contractor directly. The call went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail again. He left a message that he later characterized to himself as firm, and that was probably somewhat beyond firm, and then he put the phone down and stood in the kitchen looking at the coffee maker and understood that the renovation had just gotten significantly more complicated. He called Isabel at 7. "I saw the email," she said. "How long have you been up?" "Since 5. I have rounds at 8. A pause. "How bad is it?" "We lose the drainage window if we don't have a replacement crew on site within 3 weeks. The French drain system along the east foundation is the critical path item. Everything else can flex. But if that doesn't go in before the ground softens, we push the whole exterior phase to late spring, and the interior conversion can't start until the exterior is weather tight." She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was processing, not disengaging. "So we need someone in 3 weeks. 2.5, realistically. Do you have candidates?" "I have 2 calls in. I have a third name from the Hartford architect who's been solid throughout. I'll have answers today." "Okay." Another pause. "Ethan?" "Yeah." "Thank you for being on this before 7 in the morning." He didn't know what to say to that. He said, "It's the job!" And they hung up, and he poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the renovation binder he'd been building since December, 3 inches thick now, tabbed and annotated, permit receipts, and contractor quotes and inspection schedules and a project timeline he updated every Sunday evening, and began making calls. This was not what Ethan Calloway had spent 20 years building a career for. He understood that. He was 42 years old. He ran a private equity firm that managed north of $400 million in assets, and he was sitting in his kitchen making contractor calls for a renovation project that had no financial return, for a woman who had made it clear this arrangement was professional and nothing more, for a house that was no longer his. He made the calls anyway. The third contractor, a man named Ray Dufresne, 60 years old, operated a general contracting firm out of Farmington that had done healthcare facility renovations for 30 years, drove out to the estate that Thursday and walked the property with Ethan for 2 hours in the February cold. He wore a canvas jacket and work boots and carried a yellow legal pad and asked questions that demonstrated he had actually read the project specifications Ethan had sent him the night before. "The East Foundation drainage is manageable," Ray said, standing in the dead garden looking at the foundation line. "I've got a crew that can be here Monday. We work through weather. Previous contractor gave me 4 weeks on that phase." "Your previous contractor was padding." Ray made a note on the legal pad. 2.5 weeks, weather permitting. I don't pad my estimates because it makes clients trust me less when things actually do go long. And when things go long, then I tell you why and show you the documentation, and we adjust. I don't disappear into my email. Ethan had been in enough negotiations to know when a person was telling him what he wanted to hear and when a person was simply telling him the truth. Ray Dufresne had the affect of a man who found deception more trouble than it was worth. "Monday," Ethan said. "Monday," Ray confirmed. He started driving to Ashford 3 or 4 times a week. In the beginning, this was entirely logistical. Site meetings with Ray, walkthroughs with the accessibility compliance inspector, calls with the Hartford General Partnership Coordinator that he'd taken to joining in person rather than by phone because the details were dense enough that he wanted to be looking at the floor plan when they discussed them. But as February moved toward March and the drainage work went in and the first interior demolition began on the East Wing guest rooms, he found himself driving out on days when there was no particular meeting to attend. He told himself it was because something always needed to be checked, which was true enough. Renovation projects generated questions the way old houses generated drafts, constantly, through gaps you hadn't anticipated. He was on the phone with Ray, or the architect, or the health facility consultant most days, and the calls went better when he was on site because he could look at the actual wall or the actual door frame rather than a photograph. But he also just liked being there. He'd never liked being at the estate as a child, had found it formal and quiet in ways that felt suffocating. Now the formality was gone. The house was in the organized chaos of renovation. Plastic sheeting over doorways, dust in the light, the sound of tools from 2 or 3 locations at once, Ray's crew moving through the rooms with the focused competence of people who understood their job. It felt like something waking up, like a building that had been holding its breath finally beginning to exhale. Mrs. Pruitt remained. She operated with unbroken authority over the kitchen and the parts of the house not actively under renovation, feeding Ray's crew coffee at 7 every morning with the efficiency of a field kitchen and engaging in long factual conversations with the plumbing contractor about pipe diameter specifications that Ethan suspected she found genuinely interesting. Evelyn came on weekends. She walked the rooms with Isabel, who came when she could, Saturdays mostly, sometimes a Sunday afternoon, occasionally a weekday evening when she finished at the hospital early enough to make the drive before dark. She and Ethan had fallen into a working rhythm that was more comfortable than he had any right to expect. They communicated mostly by text during the week, project updates, questions that needed her input as the foundation's director, decisions that were hers to make. When she was on site, they went through the rooms together. They were careful with each other. That was the only word for it. There was nothing cold about it. The care was warm, actually, warmer than he'd anticipated, but it was deliberate. They were 2 people who had been through something that left them both tender in places they were still figuring out, and they navigated each other the way you navigate a room where some of the furniture has been moved and you haven't fully updated your map of it. One Saturday in early March, standing in what had been the formal sitting room and would become the main common room for resident families, Isabel said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from the spec sheet he was holding. "When your mother first told me about the trust," she said, "I said no." He hadn't known that. "You said no." "I said I didn't want it. I said it would be—" I used the word complicated, which was inadequate. I meant that it would put me in a position I hadn't asked to be in and didn't know how to be in with any dignity. She looked at the stripped walls. The old wallpaper was gone. The plaster was exposed. The bones of the room visible in a way they never were when it was dressed and furnished and functional. Your mother sat with that for about 4 minutes, and then she said that dignity was exactly the point. That the house should go to someone for whom receiving it was complicated rather than simple. That the people who receive things simply are rarely the people who know what to do with them. Ethan looked at the exposed plaster. "She's not wrong," he said. "She's almost never wrong," Isabel said, "which I suspect you've known for 42 years and found very inconvenient." He laughed. It came out louder than he expected in the stripped room. An honest laugh. Unguarded. The kind he hadn't produced in months. Isabel looked mildly surprised and then smiled. And the smile was not the composed, careful expression she deployed in difficult situations, but something more undefended. Something that reminded him of the green dress and the plasterwork ceiling and 11 years ago when they were people who made each other laugh without effort. The moment passed. They both let it pass. But it left something behind in the room. He ended a fund. In March, Callaway Capital had been managing a real estate development fund that had been Ethan's project for 7 years, a vehicle that had returned well and that the firm's investors were comfortable with, and that Ethan had built from initial conception to its current state through a combination of technical skill and the kind of relentless focus that didn't leave much room for anything else. He called a meeting with his executive team and announced he was winding it down. Conrad, who was present for all executive meetings, had the particular expression of a man absorbing information he had not been briefed for and was trying not to show how much this alarmed him. The senior partners were less restrained. Marcus Hale, who was 53 and had been at Callaway since Ethan's father's time, leaned forward and said, "Can you help us understand the thinking?" "The fund has run its course," Ethan said. "The market position it was built around has changed. We're not adding value. We couldn't add through existing vehicles. The returns are still strong. Returns are a lagging indicator. The work itself stopped being interesting 18 months ago, and we've been executing on inertia." He looked around the table. "I'd rather make that call cleanly than wait for the returns to tell us what I already know." "What does this mean for the team?" said Julia Park, who managed investor relations and whose first loyalty, sensibly, was to the people in the fund rather than the fund itself. "Transition packages are generous. I'll be personally involved in placement for anyone who wants support finding their next position." He meant it. He had already drafted the packages the night before. "This isn't a cost-cutting exercise." "Then what is it?" Marcus said. Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly. "It's a correction," he said, "in the direction of things that matter." Marcus studied him. Marcus had known Ethan's father and had watched Ethan grow into the firm over 20 years, and his observations tended toward accuracy. "This is about the estate project," Marcus said. "It's about more than that, but yes, partly. You're unwinding a $400 million fund to go manage a renovation project." "I'm unwinding a fund that no longer requires what I specifically have to offer," Ethan said, "to make room for work that does. They're not mutually exclusive." He paused. "We have 4 other vehicles that are healthy and growing. The firm is not in danger. I'm not having a breakdown. I've made a considered decision." Marcus sat back. He looked at Ethan the way he'd looked at him several times over the years, with an assessment that was neither warm nor cold, simply accurate. "Your father unwound a fund in 1989, Marcus said. Used the capital and the freed time to build the infrastructure division. Everybody told him he was making a mistake." He picked up his pen. "It became the best returning segment we had for 15 years. I remember. He used to say that the thing that makes you think a decision is wrong is usually the same thing that makes it right." Marcus made a note on his legal pad. "I'll start the wind-down process. But April arrived and the East Wing was fully framed for conversion. Ray had the guest room stripped to studs and rebuilt. Wider door frames, roll-in shower configurations for the family suites, hospital-grade ventilation where the rooms clustered nearest the common areas. The kitchen was being expanded into what had been a pantry and storage room, the kind of expansion that required structural work misses. Pruitt monitored with proprietary interest, offering opinions on the placement of the prep counters, that the kitchen contractor initially bristled at and eventually incorporated because she was correct. The library, his father's library, with the survey map and the green-shaded lamp, was the last room Ethan had asked Ray to touch. He hadn't been ready for it. He'd walked past it every visit while the rest of the house was being dismantled and reconstructed around it, and the door stayed closed. One evening in mid-April, he was the last person on site. Ray's crew had left at 4. Isabel had a late case and wasn't coming. His mother had been that morning and gone back to her house in Westport. He was walking a final check of the day's work, noting 2 items on the punch list, photographing a wall-tie detail he wanted Ray to reconsider, and he came to the library door. He stood there for a moment. He opened it. The room was exactly as it had been in November. The books, the lamp, the survey map on the wall, the wingback chair in the corner where Isabel had sat during the conversation that had rearranged his life. His father's desk, cleared now. Evelyn had taken the personal items in February, but still occupying the center of the room with its mahogany solidity. He walked to the map. 412 acres in 1887. The original Callaway land, the thing his great-great-grandfather had built a life on, drawn in ink that had faded to the color of old tea. He'd looked at it his whole life without looking at it. He looked at it now. The careful surveyor's lines, the compass rose in the corner, the handwritten acreage notation at the bottom. His father had kept it as a reminder of what carelessness costs. He stood in front of it for a long time. Then he took it down from the wall. Not to discard it, he held it and looked at the back. There was a note there, in his father's handwriting, that he'd never known existed. A few lines in pencil, the writing compressed and careful in the way his father wrote when he was being deliberate. For whoever stands in this room after I'm gone, this land was reduced by those who forgot what it was for. Whatever remains, use it for something that matters. The size of what you hold is not what you'll be measured by. Ethan stood in the empty library with his father's words in his hands, and the renovation sounds that had filled the house for months were gone, and the quiet was complete. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he put the map carefully on the desk and took out his phone and took a photograph of the inscription and sent it to Isabel with no message attached. She responded 20 minutes later. He was in the car by then on the dark Connecticut road. Her message said, "I'll have it framed and hung in the common room, where people can see it." He read it twice, then he drove. In late April, Isabel called him to the hospital. Not the estate, Hartford General, which Ethan had visited twice since the partnership conversation started, but never with any particular comfort. Hospitals had always struck him as places where the ordinary rules of social competence didn't apply, where you either knew what you were doing or you were useless. She met him in the lobby and walked him to the pediatric oncology floor without explaining what she wanted to show him, which he'd learned over the months of working together was her method when she thought explanation would prejudice observation. She stopped at the door of a family lounge, a room adjacent to the nursing station, institutional furniture, a small table with a coffee maker, fluorescent light, the particular flatness of a room designed for function rather than presence. A family was in it. A man Ethan's age wearing a jacket with a logo from a landscaping company in western Massachusetts, and a woman who had the exhausted precision of someone running entirely on will, and a boy of about 7 who was drawing something elaborate on a piece of paper, while his parents sat with untouched coffee and not quite looking at each other. Ethan stood at the door and looked at them and understood without being told what Isabel wanted him to see. This family had driven from western Massachusetts. They were in a hospital 45 minutes from home, but far enough that going back each night was impractical, especially as the treatment intensified. The room they were sitting in was where people waited. Not lived, not rested, not recovered. Waited, in a room that had no capacity to hold them, in chairs that had no capacity to give them anything. He looked at the boy drawing. He thought about the East Wing, where 6 family suites were taking shape with actual beds and real showers and windows that looked at the garden. He thought about the kitchen, where Mrs. Pruitt had opinions about the counter placement, because she understood that a kitchen where people could make themselves a real meal at 10 at night was a different thing from a room with a coffee maker. He thought about his father's map on the library wall. Use it for something that matters. He turned to Isabel. She was watching him. "When does it open?" he said. "If we stay on schedule, October." What do you need between now and October? She looked at him carefully. The renovation is on track. The partnership documentation is with Hartford General's legal team. The grant applications, not the project, he said. What do you need? She understood what he meant. He could see it, the slight shift in her expression that meant she was deciding whether to let herself be understood. I need someone who will still be there in year 3, she said. When the grant funding needs to be renewed and the partner hospital decides it wants to renegotiate the terms and something in the building breaks that costs more than the operating reserve, I don't need someone who is here because they feel they owe me something. She looked at him steadily. That debt runs out eventually, and then where does that leave the foundation? I'm not here because I feel I owe you. Tell me why you're here then. He looked back through the window at the family in the lounge. The boy had finished his drawing and was holding it up to show his father, who looked at it and nodded, and said something that made the boy look satisfied. And that small exchange, the drawing held up, the nod, the satisfaction, was so ordinary and so enormous at the same time that Ethan had to look away. Because I missed something, he said. I had a whole life that I built to be impressive, and I missed something in it, something basic. He looked at the floor, then at her. I'm not trying to buy my way back in. I'm not trying to earn something from you. I'm here because this... He gestured, a loose gesture that took in the floor, the lounge, the hospital, the whole chain of events that had led him here. This is the first thing in a long time that I've done that I would want to be remembered for. That's it. That's the whole reason. Isabel held his gaze. She didn't say anything for a moment. He had the feeling she was measuring him. Not skeptically, not suspiciously, but the way a doctor checks vitals. Carefully, looking for what's actually there rather than what the patient wants to report. Okay, she said. Okay. I need a board structure, she said. The foundation needs proper governance, and I need people on that board who understand both healthcare policy and financial management. I have 2 people in mind from the medical side. I don't have the financial side. I can help with that. I know you can. That's why I'm telling you. She started walking back toward the elevator. He fell in beside her. I also need someone to talk to the families when they arrive, not me. I'm their doctor, and that relationship is already established. Someone they don't know who can explain the house and what it offers and help them understand they're allowed to use it. She pressed the elevator button. I've been trying to figure out who does that. Who do you want it to be? The elevator opened. She got in. He got in. The doors closed. Someone who has actually lost something, she said, and knows it. Someone who doesn't come in with the assumption that they understand what these families are going through, but who can sit in a room with a stranger and just be there, without an agenda. She looked at the elevator numbers. I kept coming back to the same person. I kept talking myself out of it because the situation is complicated and there are legitimate reasons to keep things professionally bounded. He didn't say anything. Then I figured that every good thing I've ever been involved in has had some version of complicated in it. And deciding complicated is a reason to stop has never gotten me anywhere useful. She looked at him. So, the person I want is you. He stood in the elevator with that. The doors opened on the lobby. Neither of them moved for a second. All right, he said. Good. She stepped out. The first families are already on a waiting list for October. I'll introduce you before then so you're not walking in cold. They walked through the lobby together, out through the automatic doors and into the April afternoon, which was sharp and clear and smelled like the particular green of early spring, something new and not yet established, still deciding what it was going to become. Isabel, he said, on the sidewalk. She stopped. He wanted to say something about the boy with the drawing, about the East Wing Suites, about his father's inscription on the back of the map. He wanted to say something about the pond in October and the green dress in the foyer and all the years of a life he'd built in the wrong direction. He didn't say any of that. Thank you, he said, for not making it easier than it should be. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and unguarded and real. You're not an easy person, she said. It wouldn't be honest to make it easy. No. But you're... She stopped, picked the word with care. You're trying, and that's not nothing. She looked at him. It's actually not nothing at all. She turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance. He stood on the sidewalk in the April light, and watched her go and felt the weight of everything that had happened since November settle onto him in a way that didn't crush. It just registered, full and real. The way things feel when you're no longer managing the distance between yourself and them. Behind him, the parking lot, the ordinary world. Strangers going to and from their cars. In front of him, through the glass doors, the hospital hummed with the work of keeping people alive. He stood between those two things for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked to his car and drove toward the Connecticut hills and the house that would open in October, and the work he was only beginning to understand how to do. The Carter House Foundation opened on a Saturday in October, not with a ceremony. Isabel had been specific about that from the beginning. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, no photographs staged for a press release. She'd had one conversation with the communications director at Hartford General, who had suggested a small media event to raise the foundation's profile, and she'd listened politely for 4 minutes and then said, very clearly, that the families who would be using the house had not agreed to be anyone's publicity material, and the day the first residents arrived would be about them and nothing else. The communication director had suggested a separate event, then donors, board members, a Saturday afternoon in the garden. After, Isabel had said. We do that after. When the house is working, when I can show people something real instead of something staged. So there was no ceremony, there was just a morning in October when Ray Dufresne's crew did a final walkthrough, found 3 small punch list items they corrected before noon, and then packed their tools into trucks and left. Mrs. Pruitt made sandwiches for the crew before they went, which she had been doing every Friday for 8 months, and Ray shook her hand at the door and told her the kitchen counter placement was perfect, which made her say, "Of course it is," without a trace of humor, which made Ray laugh in a way that suggested he'd genuinely come to like her. Ethan watched the last truck pull down the gravel drive from the front steps. The house was quiet behind him, fully quiet for the first time since February. No saws, no compressors, no boots on subfloor. The renovation was done. What had been a private estate for 70 years had become something else, and the transformation was complete in the way that renovations are never quite complete. There would be things to fix, adjustments to make, problems that only revealed themselves once people were actually living inside the walls. But the essential work was done, and the house stood in the October morning looking the way a thing looks when it has finally become what it was supposed to be. He stood there in the cold and looked at the oaks along the drive. They were turning. The Connecticut fall coming through in the leaves, gold and rust, and the particular deep red of the maples at the property edge. And the sky above them was the flat, clear blue that only happens in October, a blue so specific to the season it almost reads as a color invented for it. He heard the front door open behind him. Isabel stepped out and stood beside him. She had a coffee mug in both hands and her hair was down, and she was wearing the gray blazer she'd worn to the first dinner. He recognized it without meaning to, without wanting to attach significance to it, and attach significance to it anyway. "Ray left?" she said. 10 minutes ago. She looked at the drive, at the oaks. "How does it feel?" he said. She considered the question honestly, which was what she always did. "Strange. Like I've been moving so fast in one direction for so long that now I've stopped, I'm not sure what my legs are supposed to do." She looked at the mug. "Good strange, but still strange. The first family arrives Monday." "I know." She'd told him about them. A family from Springfield, Massachusetts. A girl named Priya, 8 years old, mid-treatment for a pediatric brain tumor, enrolled in a trial at Hartford General that Isabel was not directly supervising but had helped facilitate. Parents both in their late 30s. No family nearby. They'd been driving 2 hours each way on treatment days from their apartment, sleeping in the car on the days when the drive back was too much. Priya would have a room on the second floor. Her parents would have the suite adjacent. There was a common room with books and a television and a table big enough for a family to eat at together, and his father's land grant map in its new frame on the wall. The inscription visible now to anyone who looked. The surveyor's lines and his father's penciled words no longer private, but offered out, like most things in this house, for whoever needed them. He looked at the map in his mind. "I want to be useful on Monday," he said. "When they arrive, tell me what that looks like from your side." "It looks like you being at the door when they pull in," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt will be inside. I'll be at the hospital until 4. I have a procedure I can't reschedule, so it'll be you. She looked at him. Can you do that without making it about you? I've been practicing. I know. I've watched you. She turned back to the Oaks. Don't explain the foundation. Don't give them the history of the house. Don't tell them anything about what it used to be or who built it or what it cost to renovate. She paused. Just show them the room. Ask if they need anything. Tell them Mrs. Pruitt makes breakfast at 7 and they don't have to come down if they don't want to. Another pause. And if the mother cries, don't try to fix it. I know not to try to fix it. You used to not know that. I know, he said. They stood there for a moment in the quiet. The coffee mug made a small sound against her ring when she adjusted her grip. A crow moved through the oaks, its sound carrying in the cold air with the particular clarity that cold gives to sound. He thought about what to say and decided not to say it. Some things had been accumulating between them for months, with the slow, undeniable patience of something that doesn't require acknowledgement to exist. He was aware of it. He suspected she was aware of it. They had both been operating with a careful and deliberate restraint that was partly professional and partly protective, and partly, he thought, a shared understanding that the timing of things mattered and that rushing towards something real was the surest way to break it before it could hold weight. He hadn't pushed, she hadn't invited. They had worked instead, side by side, for 8 months, in the specific intimacy of a shared project, the kind of intimacy that builds without announcing itself. In site meetings and late phone calls and the particular shorthand that develops between two people who have spent enough time solving problems together that they no longer need to explain their reasoning from the beginning. I talked to my mother yesterday, he said. How is she? Sharp, critical, occasionally kind, the usual. He paused. She said something I've been thinking about. Isabel waited. She said, I'd been telling her about the board meeting, the governance structure, the grant renewal timeline, and she listened to all of it, and then she said, Ethan, I didn't give the house away to give you a project. I gave it away to give you a mirror. Isabel was quiet. I think I understand what she meant now, he said. What do you think she meant? That none of this... He gestured, the same loose gesture he'd made in the hospital corridor in April. None of it is about the house, or the foundation, or even the families. All of that matters, and it's real, but the thing she was pointing at was whether I could become someone I could actually recognize. He looked at the Oaks. Someone who wasn't just building impressive things and calling it a life. Isabel turned to look at him. He held her gaze. I don't know if I'm there yet, he said. I think I'm less of a disaster than I was in November, but I'm not there. Nobody gets there, she said. That's not a thing that happens. You just get closer, more honest, harder to surprise by your own worst instincts. Is that enough? It's what there is. She looked at him steadily. It's what everybody gets. He nodded slowly. It wasn't comfort, but it was true, and she'd always been the person in his life who told him true things even when comfort was available. And that quality, which he had found difficult for years and now found essential, was among the things he'd missed most when she was no longer there to offer it. The first family arrived at 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon. A gray minivan pulled up the gravel drive, the same drive Ethan had pulled into in November, silk-dressed and strategic, with Diane Marsh beside him and the whole evening arranged wrong. And a man got out first, then a woman, then a small girl in a knit hat that had a pom-pom on top and was slightly too big for her head, which she pushed back impatiently as she looked up at the house. Ethan opened the front door and stood at the top of the steps. You must be the Nair family, he said. The man, Dev Nair, 38, the landscaping company jacket replaced today by a clean fleece, looked up at him with the expression Ethan had come to recognize from the hospital family lounge. The expression of a person running on reserves they no longer knew the depth of, deployed in a situation where dignity felt both essential and effortful. That's us, Dev said. The woman, Ananya, 36, had her hand on Priya's shoulder. She was taking in the house with the careful, overwhelmed look of someone who had been told to expect something and is now recalibrating what something means. Priya had looked at the house for 3 seconds and was now looking at the garden. There are trees, she said, not to anyone in particular. An observation. There are, Ethan said. There's a path through them that goes all the way to a pond. You can see it from your window. Priya looked at him. She had the direct, unfiltered gaze of a child who had spent enough time in hospitals being assessed by adults that she'd stopped performing the social courtesies children usually perform for strangers. "Is the pond cold?" she said. "Very cold now. It'll freeze in about a month." "I've never seen a frozen pond." "Then you're here at the right time." Ananya made a sound, small, suppressed. He didn't look at her directly. He looked at the drive, at the minivan, at Dev and said, "Can I help with the bags?" And Dev said yes, and they moved together toward the car with the ordinary logistics of arrival, which was exactly what was needed. Mrs. Pruitt met them inside. She showed them the room, the kitchen, the common room. She told them about breakfast at 7 and said it was not mandatory, which she managed to deliver in a tone that somehow made it sound both welcoming and completely without judgment. She showed Priya the bookshelf in the common room and said there were more books upstairs if she needed them. Priya ran her finger along the spines without taking any of them. "Can I go look at the garden?" she said. "It's cold," her mother said. "I have my coat." Mrs. Pruitt looked at Ananya with the particular expression of a woman who has no biological grandchildren and has been compensating for this through other means. "I'll take her. You and your husband settle in." Ananya looked at Priya, then at Mrs. Pruitt. "Okay," she said. After Mrs. Pruitt and Priya went out through the back, Ethan stood in the entry hall with Dev and Ananya, and the house was quiet around them, and Ananya sat down on the bench near the door. Not deliberately, just her legs finding the nearest solid thing, and put her face in her hands for a moment. Dev put his hand on her back. Ethan stood there. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He just stayed in his room, which was the thing Isabel had told him to do, and which he now understood was not a small thing. The willingness to be present in someone else's pain without the compulsion to make it stop, or explain it, or redirect it. After a moment, Ananya looked up. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "It's just—" She shook her head. "We've been in waiting rooms for 8 months. Everywhere we sit, it's a waiting room, and this is—" She looked at the entry hall. The wood floor and the old staircase and the light coming in through the side window and the faint smell of beeswax and cedar that had been there his whole life. "This looks like somewhere people live." "That's what it's for," he said. "That's the whole point of it." Dev looked at him. "Who were you, before?" It was a direct question, the kind exhausted people sometimes ask because they've run out of energy for the preamble. "Someone who didn't understand what things were for," Ethan said. "I'm working on it." Dev looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man who accepted that answer without needing more of it. Isabel arrived at 4:15. She came through the kitchen entrance, which she always did now. The front door was for the families, she'd said once, and had kept to it with the same quiet consistency she brought to everything. She set her bag on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment, looking at the room. Mrs. Pruitt was at the stove. Priya was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of hot chocolate and a picture book she'd picked from the common room shelf, turning pages with the absorbed concentration of a child who had found something interesting enough to slow down for. "Hello," Isabel said. Priya looked up. She took in Isabel with the same direct assessment she'd given Ethan at the door. "Are you the doctor?" "I am." "My doctor." "Not today. Today I'm just someone who lives nearby." Isabel looked at Mrs. Pruitt. "Where are her parents?" "Upstairs, resting. First time in—" Mrs. Pruitt gave a small, significant pause. "A while." Isabel nodded. She pulled out the chair across from Priya and sat down. "What are you reading?" she said. Priya turned the book so she could see the cover. "I read that one when I was your age," Isabel said. "The part where the fox finds the winter den is my favorite." Priya looked at her. "That part made me sad." "It made me sad too, but he finds it eventually." "I know." Priya turned back to the book. "I already read ahead." Isabel smiled. A real one, unguarded. Ethan had come in from the back garden a few minutes after her. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the scene. Priya with her book, Mrs. Pruitt at the stove, Isabel at the kitchen table talking to an 8-year-old about a fox. and understood something that he couldn't have named a year ago, that this was it. This was the thing. Not the estate's value, not the renovation's completion, not the governance structure, or the grant funding, or the board meetings. This exact moment, a child with hot chocolate reading a book at a kitchen table in a house that used to be about nothing but the people who owned it, this was what all of it had been building toward. He didn't announce himself. He just stood in the doorway and watched, and let it be what it was. 3 weeks after the first family arrived, the second checked in. Then the third. By December, the house had 4 families in residence. Priya's family, a family from New Haven whose son was post-surgical and receiving ongoing treatment, a grandmother who had driven from western Pennsylvania to be near her granddaughter, and a couple from Rhode Island whose twins were enrolled in a Phase 2 trial. The house handled it. That was the thing that kept surprising Ethan. Not that problems arose, because they did, constantly, the ordinary problems of a building full of people and grief and exhaustion and hope, but that the house held all of it without breaking. The kitchen was busy at strange hours. The common room had people in it at midnight. The garden path got muddy and had to be re-graveled faster than anticipated. One of the second-floor bathrooms had a pressure issue that required Ray Dufresne back on site for a Tuesday afternoon, and he came without complaint and fixed it and stayed for Mrs. Pruitt's coffee and spent 20 minutes talking to Dev Nair about the grounds maintenance, which Dev had quietly, without being asked, begun doing on the days he wasn't at the hospital with Priya. Ethan noticed Dev in the garden one morning and went out. Dev was raking leaves from the path. The maples had finished turning and the path was deep in them, and he was working with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of a man for whom physical work was a language he trusted. "You don't have to do that," Ethan said. "I know." Dev kept raking. "I need something to do with my hands or I go crazy sitting in the room." Ethan picked up the second rake leaning against the fence and raked alongside him for a while without talking. The cold air smelled like leaves and damp earth, and the faint wood smoke from the fireplace Mrs. Pruitt had started keeping lit in the common room on cold evenings. "How is she today?" Ethan said. "Better than last week. The nausea is—" Dev paused, kept raking. "They say it usually peaks around this point and then improves. Usually." He pressed the word slightly. The way parents of sick children press words like usually and often, in most cases, holding them at arm's length while also needing them desperately. "You said she's never seen a frozen pond," Ethan said. "Not yet. Should happen in about 3 weeks, the way the temperature's been." Dev nodded, raked a row of leaves into the pile. "She talks about it," he said. "When she wakes up at night, sometimes she doesn't want to go back to sleep, and I come down and sit with her and she talks. She talks about the pond. She talks about the fox in that book. There's a fox in a book she's been reading. Have you seen her reading it?" He glanced at Ethan. "She wants to know if foxes actually come to ponds in winter." "They do," Ethan said. "My father saw one out there. He told me about it once. I didn't pay much attention at the time." Dev was quiet for a moment. "You know," Dev said, "when we got the call that this place existed, that there was somewhere to stay, a real house, with a kitchen," he shook his head. "Ananya cried for 20 minutes. I thought something was wrong, and she said no. She said she'd been so braced for everything to be hard that finding out something was going to be not hard made her fall apart a little." Ethan kept raking. "I understand that," he said. They finished the path and stacked the leaves at the far end of the garden, and Dev went back inside and Ethan stood at the edge of the pond for a while. The surface was still. No ice yet, but the water had the dark, opaque quality it gets before freezing, like it's holding its breath. He thought about his father seeing a fox here. He wished he'd paid attention to that story. He was learning late that the stories people tell you are often the closest they can get to telling you who they are, and that not listening is a form of refusal that costs more than you understand until the person is gone and the stories are gone with them. He'd spent 42 years not listening. He was trying, now, to listen to everything. Isabel came to him in December. Not to the estate, to the apartment in Manhattan, which he was still living in, though he'd begun spending enough time in Connecticut that the apartment had taken on the slightly abandoned quality of a space that isn't anyone's real home. She called first. He let that register. That she called, didn't text, called to notes, and answered. "Can I come by?" she said. "I have something to tell you." She arrived at 7 with the specific energy of a person who has made a decision they're still carrying the weight of. The decision made, but the carrying ongoing. She stood in his kitchen. She'd been to the apartment a handful of times over the months, for board meetings he'd hosted here, but never alone like this, and put her bag on the counter and looked at him. "Hartford General wants to expand the model," she said. "What does that mean?" "What?" "They want to replicate the Carter House structure at 3 other locations, one in New Haven, one in Bridgeport, and one eventually in Providence. They want to use our operational framework as the template." She paused. "They want me to lead the expansion as an advisory director, not leave the clinical work. I won't do that, and they know it, but build out the organizational infrastructure for the other sites." "That's significant." "It's very significant." She looked at him. "It's also more than I can do alone." He understood what she was saying. "You're asking if I'll stay involved. I'm asking more than that." She looked down at his kitchen counter, then back up. "I'm asking if you want to build this. Not manage a project, build something. Over years." She paused. "With me." The last 2 words landed differently from the rest. They both heard it. She didn't walk it back. She held his gaze with the same directness she brought to everything that mattered to her, and he understood that she was being precise, that "with me" meant what it said, and she had decided, after months of careful watching, that the precision was earned. He thought about November. The dining room, the 4-place settings, the way the evening had deconstructed him piece by careful piece until there was nothing left to hide behind. He thought about standing in the corridor outside the study, knowing something was about to end. He thought about the boy with the drawing held up for his father. He thought about Priya and the fox and the frozen pond and the way a house built for one family's pride had become a place where strangers could sleep and eat and cry and keep going. He thought about his father's inscription, "Use it for something that matters." "Yes," he said, "I want to build this." She held that for a moment. "It won't be easy," she said. "The expansion will have problems we can't anticipate. The governance will be complicated at 3 additional sites. The funding model isn't fully tested at scale." She looked at him. "And the personal side of this," she gestured between them with a small, slightly tired gesture. "That won't be easy either. We've both got patterns, old ones, the kind that come back when things get hard. I know. I need you to be honest with me when you're struggling. Not managed, not the boardroom version. Actually honest." "I know," he said again. "I'm asking for the same from you." She nodded. "Then we agree on the terms. Are there more terms?" 1. She looked at him steadily. "No more choosing comfortable over real. Whatever this is, whatever we're building personally and professionally, if it gets hard and the comfortable option appears, we don't take it. We talk about it instead." He met her eyes. "No more comfortable over real," he said. "Good." She picked up her bag. He looked at her, at the gray blazer she wasn't wearing tonight, at the dark hair, at the expression on her face that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, something that lived between relief and readiness, and the particular look of a person who has done a hard thing and found it was the right one. "Stay," he said. "For dinner. It doesn't have to be anything. I have food." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said, "but I'm cooking. You're a terrible cook." "That's completely accurate," he said. The pond froze in the first week of January. Priya saw it from the second-floor window at 7 in the morning and came downstairs in her pajamas to find Ethan in the kitchen getting coffee, and she said without preamble, "The pond is frozen," with the urgency of a person reporting critical information. "I know," he said. "I saw it from outside." "Can I go see?" "After breakfast." "Before breakfast." "It'll still be frozen after breakfast." She considered this with the suspicious logic of an 8-year-old evaluating an adult's reasoning. "What if it melts?" "It won't melt before breakfast. It's 12 degrees out there." She looked at the window. She was still pushing the pom-pom hat back on her forehead, a habit she'd had since the day she arrived. The hat slightly too big, constantly migrating toward her eyes. "Okay," she said. After breakfast. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and put her elbows on the counter and picked up the small book she'd been reading. A new one. She'd worked through 3 of the bookshelf books since October, and read it while Mrs. Pruitt made oatmeal, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of a morning, and outside the Connecticut January held everything in its cold, clear grip. Her parents came down at 8. Dev's hand went to Priya's hair for a moment as he passed, the unconscious gesture of a parent, and Priya didn't look up from her book, which was exactly what children do when the people who love them are nearby and they feel safe enough to be absorbed in something else. Ethan watched that and felt it land somewhere. At 8:45 he walked Priya to the pond. She was bundled in her coat and the pom-pom hat and the scarf her mother had wrapped twice around her neck, and she walked fast, the way children walk when they're trying to contain excitement and not quite managing it. Ethan walked beside her on the gravel path through the garden, past the brown stems of the rose bushes, past the stone bench his grandmother had placed at the garden's center, out through the gap in the old hedge to the wider ground beyond. The pond was frozen solid. The surface was white near the edges where ice had pushed up slightly from the shoreline, and gray clear toward the center, and in the January morning light it looked like something poured and set, like the water had simply decided to stop. Priya stopped at the edge. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "Can you walk on it?" she finally said. "Not yet. Not for another week or 2. "But you could." "Later, yes." She crouched down, the crouching precision of a child examining something important, and looked at the ice surface close up. There were bubbles caught in it near the shore, and a leaf preserved beneath the surface, and the faint texture of where the water had moved before it stopped. "The fox comes here," she said. "At night." "I think so. My father told me about it. Have you seen it?" "No." He paused. "But I'm keeping an eye out." She stood up and looked at the ice and then at the tree line on the far side. "I want to be here when it comes," she said. "We'll watch for it together," he said. She turned and looked at him, the direct, unfiltered gaze she'd brought to everything since she arrived. And something in her face had the open quality of a child who has made a decision to trust a specific adult and is informing them of this fact. "Okay," she said. They walked back toward the house. The garden in January was bare and honest, the structure of it visible without the cover of leaves or bloom, the paths and the stone bench and the skeletal roses and the old hedges all present as themselves, nothing decorative about them, just the actual bones of a thing that had grown over decades and would grow again. Ethan had spent his whole life in this garden without ever really seeing it. He saw it now. At the back steps, Isabel was standing with a coffee mug. She'd spent the night. They'd fallen into a quiet habit of this over December. Not every night, but some nights. The easy domesticity of 2 people who had found their way back to each other not through passion or declaration, but through the long, patient work of actually showing up, day after day, in ways that could be counted on. "Frozen?" she said to Priya. "Completely," Priya reported. She pushed the pom-pom hat back and went up the steps past Isabel and into the house. Isabel watched her go and then looked at Ethan. "Her latest scans are in," she said, quietly. He looked at her. "They're good," she said. "Better than the last set." He exhaled. She reached out and put her hand on his arm for a moment. Not long, just a moment, the warmth of it through his coat sleeve. He put his hand over hers briefly, and then she moved toward the door, and he followed her inside. And behind them the garden sat in the January cold, bare and real, everything unnecessary stripped away, only what mattered left standing. There are people who spend their whole lives constructing an image of themselves and confuse the image for the person. Ethan Calloway had been that man. He'd built the image with intelligence and money and the kind of tactical competence that passes for character if nobody looks too closely, and he'd lived inside it for 42 years without once asking what was underneath. It took the loss of everything he thought defined him to find out. The estate, the inheritance, the relationship he'd traded a real marriage for, all of it had fallen away in the span of one dinner and one conversation and one drive back to the city in the November dark. And what was left when it fell was not, as it turned out, nothing. What was left was a man who was capable of shame, which meant he was capable of growth. A man who could stand in a hospital corridor and look through a window at a family in a waiting room and feel the weight of what they were carrying, which meant his capacity for empathy had not been destroyed, only buried under years of not needing it. What Evelyn Calloway had understood, what his father had understood 20 years before her, writing that trust clause at a desk in a study that now served as a resource library for families holding themselves together one day at a time, was that the inheritance of a family was not its property. Property was just property. It transferred by document, it was reduced by carelessness, it changed hands. What a family passed on that actually mattered was whatever wisdom its better members could find ways to transmit to the ones who were struggling to see clearly. His father had found a way. An imperfect, complicated, difficult way that had required waiting and trust, and the risk that the message might arrive too late. It had arrived barely on time. That was the truth of it. Not that it was beautiful, not that it was inevitable, not that it was a story with a clean shape. Barely on time was what there was. And barely on time was enough. In February, the Carter House Foundation broke ground on the New Haven site. Ethan stood in a muddy, vacant lot beside a chain-link fence and watched a backhoe take the first bite out of frozen ground. And beside him, Isabel had her coat collar up against the cold and a folder of architectural drawings under her arm, and was talking to the site manager about drainage. Drainage, again, always drainage. The thing you don't see until it's wrong. And the site manager had the good sense to listen. It would take 14 months. There would be problems. The ground would give up complications they hadn't anticipated. The funding would be short by 20% in the middle and have to be restructured. A board member would resign over a governance disagreement that turned out to be about something else entirely. A family and residents would have a crisis that no amount of good architecture or careful planning could prevent, only witness. All of that would happen. And Ethan Calloway would be there for it, not as the man who owned the room, not as the man who controlled the outcome, as someone who had learned at significant cost and with no guarantee of success, the difference between building something for yourself and building something that outlasts you. He watched the backhoe work. Isabel looked over at him. Her face was red from the cold, and there was mud on her boot from the site, and her hair was doing something complicated in the wind that she was ignoring. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That my father would have liked this," he said. She thought about that. "I think he would have," she said. "I think he would have liked you, the current version." He looked at her. "He knew you," he said. "He met you." "He met the version of you I came with," she said. "This version he didn't get to meet." She looked back at the backhoe, at the raw earth. "That's the one I think he'd have liked." Ethan stood in the February cold with that, and let it be true, and let himself be the person it was said about. The backhoe worked. The ground opened. Something new began.